I specifically want to talk to Amendment 22 about why prisoners should not be eligible for assisted dying, but the Noble Lord Farmer's amendments as well, I think, are pertinent here. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, has raised the real and specific safeguard issues from the lack of medical records of prisoners, and I'm sure we'll hear more about the problems of medical care for prisoners. So the terrible terminal diagnosis that one might get as a prisoner, it would be particularly frightening, I would think, because of the lack of medical care. But that actually is not my concern. I genuinely think that regardless of where one stands on assisted dying in general, I really hope the Noble Lords will consider the very particular circumstances of those incarcerated by the state when it comes to this bill, because I really assume that sponsors of the bill would be open to, and I hope will still be open to, excluding prisoners and keeping them out of the bill on the basis, if nothing else, of their lack of autonomy. Now, I have to confess that I was rather taken aback when I heard the Minister Stephen Kinnock in the other place state that excluding prisoners from this bill would lead to a difference in treatment between prisoners and non-prisoners, as in an equality, and cited Article 8, private life, and Article 14, discrimination of the ECHR. He noted that differential treatment would require objective and reasonable justification. But it seems a bit shocking to me to have to explain this to a minister, but my objective and reasonable justification is that if you're in prison, you don't have the same rights as if you're not in prison. I didn't make that up, I think, and I know the sentencing bill has gone a bit liberal, but I am generally, and actually I think that, you are deprived of your liberty. Because many of the arguments made by advocates of the bill, which I completely understand, I think philosophically and politically, about autonomy and giving people choice and so on towards the end of life and in particular circumstances, I think is entirely appropriate as it were free people. But when you're not free and you haven't got autonomy, it brings with it a whole new range of ethical dilemmas. Now, the purpose of prison is to suspend, as I've said, certain rights from people, to protect the public, to ensure deterrence, to uphold a sense of justice in society. Go on. When the state has deprived so much autonomy from an individual, for all the reasons that we know, for criminal justice reasons, offering the option of an assisted death does not increase their autonomy in a meaningful way. So we're saying, oh, well, we're giving them choice. I mean, real choice is the right to leave. In other words, we've limited their choices. Now, why does this matter? Because actually, when the state makes the decision to deprive liberty of somebody, it's a very, very serious decision. For me, it's the worst possible punishment that you could give. You are limited in being free, which obviously I consider to be very important. And the prisoners who are in prison inevitably are depressed. They feel very often they're vulnerable in the first place, but even if they weren't, and that's why they're prone to suicidal ideation. Those of us who have done, had the privilege, I would say, of doing some work with prisoners will know that one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is tackling self-harm. People just hating themselves, hating the circumstances they're in. We do a lot of work on that. I and many others have worked on IPP prisoners, unfairly, ridiculously unfairly, still in prison, based on an abolished sentence, in prison indefinitely for often minor breaches of the law in the past. And it is always shocking when you hear of another IPP prisoner who's taken their life, who's committed suicide. And the reason why it's particularly horrible is because, as many noble lords here have articulated far better than I can, and the reason why the coroners make such a fuss about this, is because it's almost like on the state's conscience. They shouldn't be there. They're in there because of the state made a mistake with the sentencing regime that it won't resolve, and then they take their life. And it's like the state is somehow implicated in those suicides, and we make a particular point of that. But it's also the case that those of us who've worked in prisons will know that suicide prevention is something we take very seriously. Now, it doesn't matter how heinous the crime is of the prisoner. You know, they could be child abusers, they could be rapists, they could be murderers, or kind of, if there is even a hint that they might commit suicide, there's Suicide Watch. We do all sorts of suicide prevention, and the reason for that is because as a humane society, we do not think that people should be allowed to take their own life if at all possible. But the reason we have Suicide Watch in prison is because the state has somebody incarcerated, and therefore you take seriously as a humane society not letting them kill themselves. Otherwise you just say, carry on boys, no, it doesn't matter, right? And we don't do that because we think that we have to protect those prisoners in the state's care. Right, so finish. I think that the issue of letting prisoners have access and be eligible to assisted death is very close to reckless state abandonment of those prisoners to something very deeply dark. I think philosophically we end up with a penal sentence in Britain. If you think about it, if that penal sentence, ends up with the state effectively putting a prisoner to death via lethal drugs, well, I don't know, go on, but that's what would have to happen, because they'd be locked up in a prison in the state's care. The state then makes them eligible to ask for assisted dying with limited autonomy and then hands them lethal drugs. That is far, far too like capital punishment that I have long been opposed to, do not approve of, and I think, therefore, even if you don't agree with me on the rest of this bill being a completely difficult challenge to humanity, which I think it is, I nonetheless would suggest that if you pass this bill, you should exempt prisoners, absolutely exempt them from this bill.